The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's bar like angry fists demanding entry. Inside, the dim lighting cast long shadows across worn wooden tables where off-duty military personnel nursed their drinks and shared war stories. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the bitter scent of cheap whiskey, creating an atmosphere that felt both familiar and unwelcoming to outsiders. Sarah Chin sat alone at the far end of the bar, her slight frame hunched over a glass of water she'd been nursing for the past hour. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another young woman killing time, perhaps waiting for someone who was running late. Her long black hair fell in gentle waves around her face, partially concealing features that were delicate yet somehow sharp. She wore simple jeans and a plain gray sweater that did nothing to suggest the lethal training hidden beneath her unassuming exterior. What the other patrons couldn't see was how her dark eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits, identifying potential threats, and noting the positioning of every person in the establishment. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, a habit ingrained through years of specialized training that had taught her to remain calm in any situation. The water glass in her hand never trembled, despite the fact that she was deep in enemy territory, so to speak. Sarah was not here by chance. 3 weeks ago, her commanding officer had called her into his office for what would become one of the most challenging assignments of her military career. Intelligence had uncovered a potential security breach at Camp Pendleton, one of the largest Marine Corps bases in the country. Someone was selling classified information to foreign contacts, and the investigation had narrowed down to a small group of Marines who frequently gathered at Murphy's bar. Her mission was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. Infiltrate the social circle of these Marines, gain their trust, and identify the traitor. What made this assignment particularly challenging was that Sarah's background was in Army Special Forces, not the Marine Corps. She would need to convincingly play the role of a civilian while navigating the complex social dynamics of a tight-knit military community. The preparation had been intensive. For 2 weeks, she'd studied Marine culture, memorized local geography, and created a believable backstory. She was now Sarah Mitchell, a recently divorced nurse who had moved to the area to start fresh after a difficult breakup. The cover story provided reasonable explanations for her occasional knowledge of military procedures while maintaining her civilian status. As Sarah sat at the bar, she noticed a group of Marines at a corner table becoming increasingly rowdy. Their voices grew louder with each round of drinks, and their conversations had shifted from friendly banter to heated political debates. She recognized 3 of them from the surveillance photos she'd memorized: Sergeant Mike Torres, Corporal Danny Walsh, and Lance Corporal Brad Morrison. These were her primary targets, the Marines most likely to have access to the classified information that had been leaked. Sergeant Torres was the apparent leader of the group, a stocky man in his early 30s with arms covered in tattoos, and a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face. His voice carried across the bar as he regaled his companions with stories of his deployments overseas, each tale growing more embellished with every telling. Torres had been flagged by intelligence not because of any direct evidence, but because his lifestyle seemed to exceed what his military salary could support. Corporal Walsh appeared to be Torres's closest friend, nodding enthusiastically at every story and occasionally adding his own commentary. Walsh was younger, perhaps mid-20s, with the lean build of a distance runner and nervous energy that kept his hands constantly moving. His personnel file indicated financial troubles, including significant gambling debts that could make him vulnerable to outside influences. Lance Corporal Morrison was the quiet one of the group, nursing his beer slowly while listening to the others talk. He was the youngest, barely old enough to drink legally, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested he still believed in the idealistic notions of military service that cynical veterans had long since abandoned. His inclusion in the group seemed almost accidental, but intelligence had noted that his position in communications gave him access to sensitive information. Sarah knew she needed to make contact soon. Her handler had made it clear that time was running short. Another leak had occurred just 2 days ago, and there were concerns that whatever information was being sold could compromise ongoing operations in sensitive regions of the world. Lives were potentially at stake, and every day the investigation continued was another day the traitor could cause irreparable damage. The opportunity came sooner than expected. As the Marines' table grew more boisterous, their conversation turned to complaints about their commanding officers. Voices rose, and what had been harmless griping began to sound more like serious insubordination. Other patrons started glancing in their direction with disapproving looks. Morrison seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere and tried to quiet his companions, but Torres was too drunk to care about discretion. His voice boomed across the bar as he launched into a tirade about incompetent leadership and pointless missions. Walsh laughed loudly at every crude joke, while Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable. The bartender, a grizzled veteran who'd seen his share of rowdy customers, approached their table with a warning about keeping their voices down. Torres responded with a string of profanity that made even the hardened Marines at nearby tables wince. The situation was escalating quickly, and Sarah recognized this as her chance to intervene. She stood from the bar and walked toward their table, her movements casual but purposeful. Years of training had taught her how to approach potentially dangerous situations without appearing threatening. Her posture remained relaxed, her hands visible, and her expression friendly but not overly eager. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard over the ambient noise of the bar. "I couldn't help but notice you guys seem to be having a tough night. Mind if I join you for a few minutes?" The question caught all three Marines off guard. Torres stopped mid-sentence and looked up at her with bleary eyes, trying to process this unexpected interruption. Walsh's nervous energy seemed to intensify, while Morrison appeared relieved that someone was attempting to defuse the situation. "Who the hell are you?" Torres demanded, his words slurred but aggressive. "This is a private conversation." Sarah maintained her friendly demeanor despite the hostility. "I'm Sarah," she said simply. "I'm new to the area and don't really know anyone yet. Thought maybe I could buy you guys around and hear some of those stories everyone's been talking about." The mention of buying drinks seemed to soften Torres's aggression slightly. He looked her up and down appraisingly, his expression shifting from suspicion to crude interest. "You military?" he asked. "No, just a nurse," Sarah replied, sticking to her cover story. "But I have a lot of respect for what you guys do. My ex-husband was Army, so I know how hard the job can be." The mention of her ex-husband being Army caused Torres to snort derisively. "Army?" he said with obvious disdain. "Should have known better than to marry one of those wannabes." Sarah forced a laugh, playing into his prejudice. "Yeah, well, that's part of why he's my ex," she said. "I hear Marines are made of tougher stuff." This bit of flattery seemed to work. Torres gestured to an empty chair at their table, and Sarah sat down carefully, making sure to position herself where she could observe all three men while maintaining clear sight lines to the exits. The first phase of her infiltration was complete. Over the next hour, Sarah carefully worked to establish herself as a sympathetic listener. She asked the right questions, laughed at their jokes, and shared carefully crafted stories about her fictional ex-husband that painted Army personnel in an unflattering light. The Marines gradually warmed to her presence, particularly after she made good on her promise to buy several rounds of drinks. Torres, emboldened by alcohol and female attention, began sharing increasingly personal details about his military service. He complained about recent policy changes, criticized his superior officers, and hinted at knowledge of operations that he probably shouldn't have been discussing in a public setting. Sarah listened carefully, filing away every detail while maintaining the appearance of casual interest. Walsh proved to be more guarded, despite his nervous energy. He seemed to be studying Sarah with suspicious eyes, occasionally asking probing questions about her background that forced her to rely on her well-rehearsed cover story. His paranoia was either the result of natural caution or something more sinister, and Sarah made a mental note to be particularly careful around him. Morrison was the most forthcoming of the three, perhaps because he was also the most uncomfortable with the increasingly inappropriate nature of the conversation. He seemed grateful to have someone at the table who wasn't encouraging Torres's worst tendencies, and he began to open up about his own experiences in the Marines. As the evening progressed, Sarah learned that the three men had served together on multiple deployments and maintained close contact outside of their official duties. They had access to different types of classified information based on their respective positions, and their friendship created opportunities for informal information sharing that might not be properly documented. More importantly, she began to pick up on subtle tensions within the group. Torres clearly viewed himself as the leader, but there were moments when Morrison seemed to bristle at his authority. Walsh appeared to be caught in the middle, trying to maintain friendships with both men while dealing with his own personal problems. The bar began to empty as the night grew later, but the Marines showed no signs of wanting to leave. They were deep into sharing war stories now, each trying to top the others with tales of combat heroism and near-death experiences. Sarah listened patiently, occasionally asking follow-up questions that encouraged them to provide more details about their operations and the intelligence they'd handled. It was during one of these stories that she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Torres was describing a recent mission briefing, providing details that were far too specific and operational to be shared with civilians. He mentioned locations, unit designations, and tactical procedures that were clearly classified at the highest levels. What made this revelation even more alarming was the casual way he shared the information, as if he'd done this many times before. Walsh and Morrison didn't seem surprised by the level of detail, suggesting that this kind of security breach was routine for their group. Sarah realized she was sitting at a table with not just one potential traitor, but possibly three. The investigation had underestimated the scope of the security breach. This wasn't just someone selling isolated pieces of information for personal gain. This was a systemic breakdown of security protocols that threatened to expose entire operations. She needed to get this information to her handlers immediately, but she also knew that leaving too early would arouse suspicion. She had to maintain her cover while finding a way to communicate the urgency of the situation. The opportunity came when Morrison excused himself to use the restroom. Sarah waited a few minutes, then announced that she needed to make a phone call. She stepped outside into the rain, quickly activating the encrypted communication device hidden in her purse. The brief message she sent would trigger an immediate escalation of the investigation. Additional resources would be deployed, and the surveillance of all three Marines would be intensified. But Sarah knew that her most dangerous work was just beginning. She had successfully infiltrated the group, but now she had to maintain that position long enough to gather evidence that could be used in court. As she returned to the bar, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere had changed. Torres was leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, while Walsh looked more nervous than usual. Morrison had returned from the restroom and was staring at his phone with a troubled expression. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked as she sat back down. Torres's smirk widened. "Just got some interesting news," he said cryptically. "Seems like there might be some new opportunities coming up soon." The comment sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She had the unsettling feeling that her investigation had just become much more complicated and potentially much more dangerous. 3 days had passed since Sarah's first encounter with the Marines at Murphy's Bar, and she had successfully established herself as a regular presence in their social circle. Her cover as Sarah Mitchell, the recently divorced nurse, was holding up under scrutiny, though she'd noticed Walsh becoming increasingly suspicious of her sudden appearance in their lives. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of her temporary apartment, casting striped shadows across the sparse furnishings that served as her base of operations. Sarah sat at a small table, reviewing the intelligence she'd gathered over the past 72 hours. The scope of the security breach was even worse than her initial assessment had suggested. Through careful questioning and patient observation, she'd learned that Torres had been selling classified information for at least 6 months. His expensive lifestyle, which included a new motorcycle and frequent gambling trips to Las Vegas, was funded by payments from an intermediary who claimed to represent interested parties overseas. Walsh was involved as a courier, using his position in logistics to access and photograph sensitive documents. Morrison's role was more complex and troubling. He was unknowingly providing information by sharing details about communications protocols during casual conversations. The young Marine's innocence made him perhaps the most tragic figure in the entire operation. Morrison genuinely believed he was just talking with friends about his work, unaware that his companions were systematically extracting classified information from him. His trust in Torres and Walsh blinded him to their true motivations, and Sarah found herself sympathizing with his situation even as she worked to build a case against all three men. Her encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming message from her handler, Agent Rebecca Martinez. The text was brief, but urgent. Meeting tonight. Situation escalating. New intelligence suggests imminent transfer of critical information. Time running out. Sarah deleted the message and began preparing for what she knew would be a challenging evening. Intelligence had identified a pattern in the information transfers that suggested another major leak was planned for the upcoming weekend. She needed to gather enough evidence to justify arrests, but she also had to be careful not to compromise her cover too early. The plan for the evening was straightforward but risky. She would meet the Marines at Murphy's bar as usual, but this time she would attempt to get closer to Torres and learn more about his contacts. The surveillance team had identified several phone calls between Torres and an unknown number that corresponded with his meetings at the bar. If Sarah could get access to his phone or overhear a conversation, it might provide the final piece of evidence needed to move forward with arrests. As evening approached, Sarah carefully prepared her appearance and equipment. Hidden beneath her casual clothing were recording devices so small and sophisticated that even a thorough search would be unlikely to detect them. Her purse contained emergency communication equipment and a small defensive weapon that looked like an ordinary pin but could deliver an incapacitating electric shock. Murphy's bar was crowded when Sarah arrived, filled with the usual mix of military personnel and local civilians who catered to the base community. She spotted her targets immediately. Torres, Walsh, and Morrison were at their regular table in the corner, already several drinks into what appeared to be another long evening. As she approached their table, Sarah noticed something different about the group dynamics. Torres seemed agitated, constantly checking his phone and glancing toward the entrance as if expecting someone. Walsh was more subdued than usual, his nervous energy replaced by an almost grim determination. Morrison appeared oblivious to the tension, chatting cheerfully about his upcoming leave time. "Sarah," Morrison called out as he spotted her approaching. Perfect timing. Torres was just telling us about some crazy party he went to last weekend. Torres shot Morrison a sharp look that suggested the story wasn't meant for outside ears. "Just some friends getting together," he said curtly. "Nothing special." Sarah slid into the empty chair, immediately sensing the undercurrent of tension at the table. "Everything okay?" she asked. "You guys seem a little on edge tonight." "Just work stuff," Walsh replied, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "You know how it is. Sometimes the job gets stressful." Over the next hour, Sarah carefully probed for more information while maintaining her cover as a friendly civilian. She learned that Torres was expecting an important phone call, though he was deliberately vague about the details. Walsh kept checking his watch as if anticipating some predetermined schedule. Morrison remained blissfully unaware of whatever was troubling his companions. The breakthrough came when Torres's phone finally rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his expression grew serious. "I need to take this outside," he announced, standing abruptly from the table. Sarah seized the opportunity. "Mind if I come with you?" she asked casually. "I could use some fresh air, and I'm curious about that motorcycle you keep talking about." Torres hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the risks of having a witness to his conversation against the potential benefits of impressing an attractive woman with his expensive purchase. Vanity won out, and he nodded toward the exit. The parking lot behind Murphy's bar was dimly lit and largely empty, providing the perfect setting for a clandestine phone conversation. Torres's motorcycle was parked near the back fence, a gleaming piece of machinery that represented several months of military salary. As they walked toward it, his phone rang again. "I have to take this," Torres said, moving a few steps away from Sarah. "Just give me a minute." Sarah positioned herself near the motorcycle, pretending to admire its chrome details while straining to overhear Torres's conversation. The recording equipment hidden in her clothing would capture whatever she could hear, but she needed to get closer to ensure clear audio quality. "Yeah, I have it," Torres was saying into his phone, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the price just went up. This information is hotter than what we discussed before." Sarah moved closer under the pretense of examining the motorcycle's engine, bringing herself within better range of the conversation. Torres was facing away from her, focused entirely on his phone call, and apparently unaware of how much she could hear. "I don't care what we agreed to before," Torres continued. "The operation details I'm offering are worth twice what you're paying. If you want the communications protocols and the timeline, it's going to cost extra." The implications of what Sarah was hearing made her blood run cold. Torres wasn't just selling routine intelligence. He was offering operational details that could compromise active missions and put lives at risk. The urgency of stopping this transfer became even more critical. Tomorrow night, Torres said after a pause. Same place as before, but bring the full payment. And make sure your people understand. If anything goes wrong, I don't know any of you. As Torres ended the call and turned back toward Sarah, she quickly shifted her attention to the motorcycle, hoping her eavesdropping hadn't been detected. Her heart was racing, but years of training helped her maintain an outwardly calm demeanor. Beautiful bike, she said admiringly. Must have cost a fortune. Torres's chest puffed out with pride. Got a good deal on it, he said, though his explanation was deliberately vague. Sometimes opportunities just present themselves, you know. They returned to the bar, where Walsh and Morrison were engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated discussion about military policy. As they sat back down, Sarah noticed Walsh studying her with suspicious eyes, as if trying to determine how much she might have overheard. Everything good? Walsh asked Torres, though his gaze remained fixed on Sarah. All set, Torres replied cryptically. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Morrison looked confused by the exchange, but Sarah understood exactly what was being discussed. The information transfer was scheduled for tomorrow night, which meant she had less than 24 hours to coordinate with her handlers and prepare for what could be a dangerous confrontation. The rest of the evening passed slowly, with Sarah carefully maintaining her cover while internally planning her next moves. She needed to report what she'd learned without arousing suspicion, and she had to prepare for the possibility that tomorrow night's operation could expose her true identity. As the bar began to close, the Marines made plans to meet again the following evening. Sarah accepted their invitation, knowing it would likely be the last time she sat at this table as Sarah Mitchell, the friendly nurse. Tomorrow night, she would either successfully complete her mission or find herself in a life-threatening situation with 3 potentially dangerous men. Walking to her car in the darkened parking lot, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The information Torres planned to sell could compromise ongoing operations and endanger American personnel around the world. Stopping him wasn't just about catching a traitor, it was about preventing a potential catastrophe. As she drove back to her apartment, Sarah began mentally preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging phase of her mission. Tomorrow night, everything would come to a head, and she would finally learn whether months of preparation and 3 days of careful infiltration would be enough to prevent a serious breach of national security. The encrypted phone in her purse buzzed with another message from her handler. Surveillance team in position. Technical support standing by. You are cleared to proceed with final phase. Exercise extreme caution. Sarah smiled grimly as she read the message. After tomorrow night, Torres, Walsh, and Morrison would learn that the friendly nurse they'd been drinking with was actually one of the most highly trained Special Forces operators in the United States military. She only hoped that revelation would come after she'd gathered enough evidence to ensure their convictions, rather than during a violent confrontation that could jeopardize everything. The stakes had never been higher, and Sarah Chun was ready to do whatever was necessary to complete her mission successfully. Tomorrow night would determine whether she was as good as her training suggested, or whether the criminals she'd been hunting were more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The following evening arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the tension Sarah felt as she prepared for what would likely be the final phase of her undercover operation. Intelligence reports throughout the day had confirmed that Torres was planning to transfer critical classified information to his foreign contacts, and surveillance teams had identified the location where the exchange would take place. Sarah stood before the mirror in her temporary apartment, making final adjustments to her appearance. Tonight, she would need to balance maintaining her cover as Sarah Mitchell while being prepared for potential combat. Hidden beneath her casual jeans and sweater were flexible body armor and an array of specialized equipment that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her handler, Agent Martinez, had briefed her earlier that afternoon through encrypted communications. The plan was straightforward in concept but dangerous in execution. Sarah would accompany the Marines to their planned meeting location, gathering final evidence of the information transfer while a tactical team waited nearby for the signal to move in. The timing would be critical. They needed enough evidence for prosecutions, but they couldn't risk allowing classified information to actually change hands. As Sarah prepared to leave for Murphy's bar, she reflected on how much had changed since that first night 4 days ago. Then, she had been hunting for an unknown traitor among a group of Marines. Now, she knew exactly who was involved and what they planned to do, but she also understood that the most dangerous part of her mission still lay ahead. Torres, Walsh, and Morrison were already at their usual table when Sarah arrived at the bar. The atmosphere was noticeably different from previous evenings. There was an undercurrent of nervous energy that suggested all three men knew something significant was about to happen. Torres kept checking his watch and scanning the room as if looking for potential threats. Walsh seemed more agitated than usual, his nervous habits amplified to the point where other patrons were beginning to notice his fidgeting. Morrison appeared confused by his companion's behavior, clearly sensing the tension but unable to understand its source. His innocent questions about their unusual demeanor were met with sharp looks and evasive answers that only increased his bewilderment. "You guys are acting really weird tonight," Morrison said as Sarah joined them at the table. "Did something happen that I should know about?" Torres exchanged a meaningful glance with Walsh before responding. "Just some business we need to take care of later," he said curtly. "Nothing that concerns you." The dismissive tone clearly hurt Morrison's feelings, though he tried to hide his disappointment behind a forced smile. Sarah realized that the young Marine's exclusion from tonight's activities might actually work in her favor. If he wasn't present during the information transfer, he might be able to avoid the most serious charges when arrests were made. Over the next hour, Sarah carefully observed the group's dynamics while maintaining her cover. Torres received several text messages that clearly agitated him, though he was careful not to let anyone see the contents. Walsh kept glancing toward the exit as if planning escape routes, while Morrison continued to ask increasingly pointed questions about what was troubling his friends. The situation began to escalate when Torres's phone rang with what was obviously the call he'd been expecting. He moved away from the table to answer it, speaking in hushed tones that Sarah could only partially overhear despite her enhanced audio equipment. "Yeah, we're ready," Torres was saying. "Same location as discussed. 30 minutes. When he returned to the table, his expression was grim but determined. "Time to go," he announced to Walsh, who immediately began preparing to leave. "Go where?" Morrison asked, clearly frustrated by his continued exclusion from their plans. "Nowhere you need to worry about," Torres replied. "This is adult business." The patronizing response finally pushed Morrison over the edge. "Adult business?" he demanded, his voice rising enough to attract attention from nearby tables. "I've been deployed twice and seen more combat than either of you. Don't talk to me like I'm some kind of kid." Torres's expression darkened at the challenge to his authority. "Keep your voice down," he hissed. "And remember who you're talking to." Sarah recognized the signs of an escalating confrontation and realized she needed to intervene before the situation spiraled out of control. A public argument could attract unwanted attention and potentially compromise the entire operation. "Hey guys," she said in a calm, soothing voice. "Maybe we should all take a step back and cool off. Whatever's going on, I'm sure we can work it out." Torres turned his aggressive attention towards Sarah, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "This doesn't concern you either," he said coldly. "Maybe you should find somewhere else to be tonight." The dismissal was clearly intended to get rid of her, but Sarah couldn't abandon her mission when she was so close to completing it. She needed to find a way to accompany Torres and Walsh to their meeting without arousing further suspicion. "Actually," she said with forced casualness, "I was hoping we could all hang out somewhere else tonight. This place is getting kind of loud, and I thought maybe we could go for a drive or something." Walsh spoke up for the first time, his voice tense with barely controlled anxiety. "That's not happening," he said bluntly. "We have somewhere we need to be, and it's not a social occasion." Morrison's hurt expression deepened at this latest exclusion. "Fine," he said, standing abruptly from the table. "I can take a hint. I'll just find my own way home." As Morrison prepared to leave, Sarah realized that keeping him away from the information transfer was actually the best possible outcome for him. His innocence might be his salvation when the legal proceedings began. However, she also couldn't let Torres and Walsh leave without her, even if it meant exposing herself to greater risk. Come on, she said, standing and moving closer to Torres. I promise I won't get in the way of whatever you need to do. I'm just not ready to go home yet, and I enjoy spending time with you guys. Torres studied her face carefully, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of bringing her along. Sarah could see the internal debate playing out in his expressions. His vanity wanted to impress her, but his criminal instincts warned against involving civilians in his illegal activities. The decision was made when Walsh pulled Torres aside for a whispered conversation. Sarah couldn't hear what they were discussing, but she could see Walsh gesturing emphatically while Torres nodded reluctantly. When they returned, Torres's expression had changed to something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Okay, Torres said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You can come with us. But you need to understand that what you're about to see is strictly confidential. Can you handle that? The implication in his tone was unmistakable. Sarah was being invited along, but there was an unspoken threat about what might happen if she proved untrustworthy. She realized that Torres and Walsh had decided she represented a potential security risk that they couldn't afford to leave behind. Of course, Sarah replied, maintaining her innocent demeanor while internally preparing for what was likely to be a very dangerous situation. I'm good at keeping secrets. As the three of them left Murphy's bar together, Sarah activated the emergency beacon hidden in her purse. The signal would alert the tactical team that the operation was moving into its final phase and that she might soon need backup. However, she also knew that the success of the mission depended on her ability to gather evidence before the arrests were made. Torres led them to his motorcycle while Walsh retrieved a car from the parking garage across the street. The plan was apparently for Sarah to ride with Torres while Walsh followed in the car. As they prepared to leave, Sarah noticed several unmarked vehicles in the area that likely contained surveillance teams, though their occupants remained carefully hidden. The ride through the darkened streets took them away from the base and into a more industrial area of the city. Torres drove with the confident aggression of someone who knew these roads well, while Sarah held on tightly and tried to memorize their route. The recording equipment hidden in her clothing continued to capture audio, though the noise of the motorcycle engine would make much of it difficult to analyze later. After 20 minutes of riding, they arrived at what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse complex near the harbor. The area was poorly lit and largely deserted, providing the perfect setting for clandestine activities. Torres parked his motorcycle behind a large shipping container while Walsh pulled his car into a concealed position nearby. This is it, Torres announced as they dismounted. Now remember what I said about keeping secrets. Sarah nodded while carefully studying their surroundings. The warehouse complex was larger than it had appeared from the street, with multiple buildings and numerous hiding places where surveillance teams could position themselves. However, it also offered countless escape routes and potential ambush points that could make any tactical operation extremely dangerous. As they walked toward one of the larger buildings, Sarah noticed a black sedan parked in the shadows near the far entrance. Two figures were visible inside the vehicle, though she couldn't make out their faces in the dim lighting. Her training told her that these were likely Torres's contacts, the people who had been purchasing classified information for the past 6 months. There they are, Walsh whispered, pointing toward the sedan. Right on time. Torres checked his watch and nodded with satisfaction. Perfect, he said. This is going to be a very profitable evening. As they approached the meeting location, Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine the success or failure of her entire mission. Everything depended on her ability to gather evidence while avoiding detection, and she knew that any mistake could result in the loss of critical intelligence or, worse, her own death at the hands of desperate criminals who had everything to lose. The warehouse complex suddenly felt like a maze of shadows and threats, and Sarah Chun prepared herself for what could be the most dangerous encounter of her military career. The warehouse complex felt like a concrete labyrinth as Torres led Sarah and Walsh deeper into its shadowy interior. Their footsteps echoed off the empty walls, creating an ominous soundtrack that seemed to amplify the tension hanging in the air like a suffocating blanket. Sarah's training kicked into high gear as she automatically cataloged potential escape routes, defensive positions, and possible threats lurking in the darkness around them. The meeting location was in a large open space that had once housed heavy machinery, now nothing more than an empty shell with concrete pillars supporting a high ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. Torres had chosen this spot carefully. It offered clear sight lines in all directions, making it nearly impossible for anyone to approach undetected. What he didn't realize was that Sarah had already signaled for backup, and highly trained tactical teams were positioning themselves throughout the complex. Two men emerged from behind one of the concrete pillars as Torres, Walsh, and Sarah entered the designated area. Both were dressed in expensive suits that seemed oddly formal for a clandestine meeting in an abandoned warehouse. The older of the two, a man in his 50s with graying hair and cold blue eyes, stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling dangerous situations. Sergeant Torres, the man said in accented English that suggested Eastern European origins. You are punctual, which I appreciate. However, I was not expecting additional company tonight. His gaze shifted to Sarah, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical presence. Years of intelligence work had taught her to recognize dangerous men, and everything about this individual radiated lethal capability. This was not some minor intermediary. This was someone with significant resources and few moral constraints. She's nobody, Torres replied dismissively, though Sarah noticed a slight tremor in his voice that suggested he was intimidated by his contact. Just a friend who wanted to come along for the ride. She doesn't know anything about our business. The foreign operative's cold smile suggested he found Torres's explanation less than convincing. Perhaps, he said slowly. But, in my experience, there is no such thing as innocent witnesses in situations like this. My associate, and I prefer to minimize unnecessary risks. His companion, a younger man with the build of a professional athlete and suspicious bulges under his jacket that indicated concealed weapons, moved to a position where he could watch both the entrance and the group of Americans. Sarah recognized the tactical positioning and realized these men were far more professional than Torres had anticipated. Look, Torres said, his nervousness becoming more apparent. We had a deal. I brought what you wanted, you brought the payment, and we make the exchange. What happens after that is none of my business. The older man nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, we did have an arrangement. However, circumstances have changed since our last communication. The information you are offering has become, shall we say, even more valuable than we initially anticipated. Walsh shifted uncomfortably beside Torres, clearly picking up on the dangerous undercurrents in the conversation. What do you mean? He asked. We agreed on a price already. That was before we learned that American intelligence agencies have become aware of potential security breaches, the foreign operative replied. This information is now worth significantly more to us, which means it should cost significantly more as well. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the implications of what she was hearing. Somehow, these foreign agents had learned that an investigation was underway. The security breach was even worse than anyone had realized. Not only were Torres and his associates selling classified information, but their foreign contacts had somehow infiltrated American intelligence operations enough to know about ongoing investigations. Torres's face darkened with anger at the implied renegotiation. That's not how this works, he said aggressively. We had a deal, and I expect you to honor it. I'm taking enough risks as it is without having to worry about you trying to cheat me. The younger foreign operative took a step forward, his hand moving slightly closer to the concealed weapon under his jacket. I think you misunderstand the situation, he said in heavily accented English. You are not in a position to make demands. The tension in the warehouse had escalated to a dangerous level, and Sarah realized that the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Both sides were armed, both had everything to lose, and any miscalculation could result in violence that would jeopardize her mission and potentially cost lives. She also knew that the surveillance teams watching from outside were probably preparing to intervene, but they would need clear evidence of the information transfer before they could make arrests that would stand up in court. Sarah had to find a way to keep the situation stable long enough for the exchange to take place while documenting everything for legal proceedings. Maybe we should all take a step back, Sarah said in her most calming voice. I'm sure you can work out whatever issues you're having without things getting ugly. Both foreign operatives turned their attention to her, and she felt the weight of their professional assessment. These were men who killed people for a living, and they were trying to determine whether she represented a threat or just an unfortunate civilian in the wrong place at the wrong time? You know, the older man said thoughtfully, for someone who allegedly knows nothing about this business, you seem remarkably calm for someone in a potentially dangerous situation. Sarah's cover story was about to be put to its ultimate test. I'm a nurse, she replied simply. I've seen enough emergencies to know that panicking never helps anything. Whatever you guys are discussing, I'm sure you can reach an agreement that works for everyone. Torres shot her a sharp look that suggested he was beginning to have doubts about bringing her along. Maybe you should wait outside, he said curtly. This might take a while. No, the foreign operative said firmly. I think she should stay. In fact, I think all of you should remain exactly where you are until we resolve our business here. The implicit threat was unmistakable, and Sarah realized that what had begun as a straightforward information exchange had evolved into a hostage situation. The foreign agents clearly intended to control the situation completely, which meant they probably had no intention of letting any witnesses leave alive. Walsh seemed to reach the same conclusion, as his nervous energy increased to the point where his hands were visibly shaking. Look, he said desperately, we just want to make the exchange and get out of here. Nobody wants any trouble. Trouble has already found you, the younger operative replied coldly. The question now is how much additional trouble you want to create for yourselves. Torres finally seemed to understand that he was dealing with professionals far beyond his league. His military training kicked in as he evaluated potential tactical responses, but Sarah could see him reaching the same conclusion she had. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and in hostile territory with limited escape options. Fine, Torres said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Here's what you wanted. Let's just get this over with. He pulled out a thick envelope containing what Sarah assumed were photographs or photocopies of classified documents. The foreign operative gestured for his associate to collect the package while keeping his attention focused on the three Americans. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for, clear evidence of classified information being transferred to foreign agents. Her recording equipment was capturing everything, and surveillance teams outside would have visual confirmation of the exchange. However, she also knew that the most dangerous part of the encounter was just beginning. The younger operative quickly examined the contents of the envelope, nodding with satisfaction at what he found. This is acceptable, he said to his companion. The intelligence value appears to match what was promised. Excellent, the older man replied. Now we come to the matter of payment. Instead of producing money, however, the foreign operative pulled out a small electronic device that Sarah immediately recognized as a signal jammer. Her heart sank as she realized that her communication with the outside surveillance teams was about to be cut off. Unfortunately, the man continued, circumstances have changed since we began this relationship. The security risks associated with your activities have become too great for us to continue. Torres's eyes widened as he finally understood what was happening. What are you talking about? He demanded. We had a deal. Indeed we did, the operative replied with cold satisfaction. But deals can be renegotiated. The younger man drew his weapon, a pistol with a silencer attachment that confirmed Sarah's worst fears about their intentions. These weren't just criminals looking to purchase information. They were professional killers who had no intention of leaving witnesses to their activities. Walsh panicked and bolted toward the nearest exit, but he had only made it a few steps when the sound of a silenced gunshot echoed through the warehouse. He crumpled to the concrete floor, clutching his leg and crying out in pain. Nobody else needs to get hurt, the older operative said calmly, as long as everyone remains cooperative. Torres stood frozen in shock, unable to process how quickly the situation had deteriorated. Sarah knew that she had only seconds to act before the foreign agents decided to eliminate all potential witnesses permanently. The moment had come to abandon her cover and reveal her true capabilities. Years of special forces training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, and she knew that the survival of everyone in the warehouse, including herself, depended on her ability to neutralize two highly trained killers. Actually, Sarah said, her voice suddenly carrying an authority that had been completely absent from her previous demeanor, I think you're the ones who need to be cooperative. Both foreign operatives turned toward her with expressions of surprise and confusion. They had been expecting to intimidate a frightened civilian, but something in Sarah's voice and posture had changed completely. I'm Special Agent Sarah Chun, United States Army Special Forces, she announced clearly, her words carrying across the warehouse with unmistakable authority. You are surrounded by federal agents, and you have approximately 30 seconds to drop your weapons and surrender before tactical teams enter this building. The transformation in her demeanor was so complete that even Torres stared at her in shock. The friendly, innocent nurse had disappeared, replaced by a highly trained operative who radiated deadly competence. The older foreign agent recovered from his surprise quickly, his weapon swinging towards Sarah as he processed this unexpected development. Impossible, he said, though doubt was creeping into his voice. Torres, Sarah said without taking her eyes off the armed man. When I give the signal, you grab Walsh and get behind that concrete pillar. Do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, and you might survive the next few minutes. The sound of tactical teams breaching the warehouse entrances echoed through the building, confirming Sarah's claims about backup. The foreign operatives found themselves caught between a highly trained Special Forces operator and federal agents closing in from multiple directions. What had begun as a simple intelligence sting was about to become a deadly confrontation that would test every aspect of Sarah's training and determine whether her months of preparation would be enough to prevent a catastrophic security breach and save the lives of everyone involved.